to the Cannon Beach Library's Northwest Author Speaker Series. My name is Phyllis Byrne, and I'm a library volunteer. The library's Northwest Author Series presents about 8 author talks a year. Thanks to Zoom and Facebook Live, we've been able to persevere despite the pandemic, though we really look forward to going back to in-person talks as soon as we're able. Our next presentation will be on Saturday, January 15th at 2 o'clock with Tina Ontiveros, author of the memoir, Rough House. Today's presentation will be recorded and posted to the library's website and Facebook page. We welcome questions for our speaker. Just use the chat function on Facebook Live. Today, it gives me great pleasure to introduce our speaker, Deborah Reed. Deborah Reed is the author of 7 novels, including 2 thrillers, which she wrote under the name Audrey Brown. Her latest novel is Pale Morning Light with Violet Swan. Deborah has the BA from Oregon State and an MFA in creative writing from Pacific University. She taught novel writing at the Hellenic American University in Athens, Greece, and at the UCLA Extension Program in Los Angeles. She's the past co-director of the Black Forest Writing Seminars at Albert Ludwig University in Freiburg, Germany. Since July of 2019, she's been the owner of Cloud and Leaf, a wonderful independent bookstore in Manzanita, Oregon. Currently, she divides her time between Manzanita and Berlin. And today, she's taking the Northwest Author Series International for the very first time because she's joining us from Berlin, Germany. Welcome, Deborah.
Hi. Thank you for having me.
So I think why don't I just let you take it away and tell us what you prepared to share with us today.
Sure. One of the things that I really enjoy talking about, teaching, writing about, and reading is a sense of place in fiction. I think it's one of the most powerful elements of craft that can be utilized. And when it's done well, I think it adds so many layers to the art form that affects the reader on different levels as they take in the story. I've mentioned this before, but it's worth mentioning again. Let me find it here. And I'll use a couple of examples, and then what I'd like to do is read the opening of my latest novel, Violet Swan. So when I begin writing a novel, I know from the start where the characters make their home or might have made it in the past. This gives me a sharper view of the world through their eyes. To my mind, character grows organically out of place. For example, a broken heart is a fairly universal state of being. It doesn't matter where you live in the world, an aching heart will feel like an aching heart. But a rancher in Eastern Oregon who's lost the love of his life will inevitably move through the world reacting to his pain from the place beneath his feet, as opposed to, say, the ways in which a woman in a high rise in New York City with a broken heart might react to hers. The rancher may contemplate a mountain walk with his dogs to try and rid himself of memories, only to get caught unaware in a storm and end up at the mercy of the elements he wishes he were watching from his kitchen window. The landscape itself has trapped him, both metaphorically, for it too contains memories, and literally, he can't escape his emotional state any more than he can escape the storm. By contrast, the woman in New York City who, say, recently lost her beloved mother may decide to attend a work party just to get out of the house. But once there, overhears a conversation between 2 women complaining about the way their own mothers interfere with their lives. Because it seems there's no justice in this world, our woman will leave the party feeling worse than she did when she went in. Adding to her heartache will be the city lights themselves, the very lights she found beautiful and hopeful on her way into the party. Now they do nothing more than illuminate everything hard and rotten that might be found on a city street. And this mirrors her emotional state of despair. I want to give you an example by reading the opening of Violet Swan, where you can see that as the character is anchored in time and place, that the setting mirrors the emotional state of the character. And so when a reader reads along and you have two things happening at the same time, you get, it's almost like more bang for your buck. And that's something that I generally try to do in my writing. I think it makes for a more pleasurable reading experience and more satisfying. I'm just gonna get some water here. Shortly after dawn, Lucine drifted from the Telefunken radio, and Violet's eyes grew moist at the rise and fall of the cello. She turned from her lamplit canvas to the windows, the sun radiating edgewise across the yard, the garden brightening with greens and golds. This too gave her heart a clench. She stepped away, brush in hand, to the windows where the air felt charged, expectant, in the way of spring. The wooden floor creaked and clunked beneath her clogs, perhaps loud enough to wake her son Francisco and his wife Penny downstairs, though in the 40 years they'd lived beneath her, Violet had never asked about the noise and didn't want to know. Speckles of pale ochre slipped from her brush to the drop cloth and now to the fir floor. She was fond of the groaning planks, their bricolage of color and grooves running from one end of the loft to the other, crisscrossing from her workbench to the canvas, to her reading chair, kitchen sink, and bed, like a map chronicling her days. She swiped her cheeks with the sleeve of her smock. The morning still held a promise, like so many that had come before. The Ides of March had arrived, and the Irish moss between the walkway stones was now a rich emerald green. At a distance, the soft shapes resembled parakeets nestled along the path. Violet's emotions were tender as ever, humming close to the surface, her love for this world often seen through a swift convulsion of tears. But lately it felt as if the world was dismantling her into something puny and indecisive, and this was not how she imagined the end. Ever since her diagnosis at the start of the year, the days felt squeezed and the nights stretched on, hours threaded with fragments of sleep and dreams that were fleeting and strange. Lungs full of spiders, hands dissolving into dust. But this morning she woke to the gentle voice of her old friend, Ada Dupre. Bonjour, sweet Violette, as sharp as any memory that Violet had carried for decades. Ada's olive skin and freckled nose, her eyes the color of jade, lingered beyond the dream. Dance with me, Violette. Why don't we just dance? Violet had jerked out of bed and got straight into a coughing fit. Her concentration was slipping. The base coat on her canvas was only half finished, and still she remained at the windows, distracted by the light, the yard, the thick forest beyond the grass, the warm sun drawing heat from the trees, and orange gas rising. Periwinkle crocuses streamed over the lawn like light bulbs with golden filaments. Barn swallows flitted to and from phone wires, their steely blue wings and mustard bellies flashing in the sun. The Oregon coast had finally thrown off its gray sky cape and stepped into the fuller light of spring. Violet coughed into a tissue from her pocket, catching rust-colored flecks against the white. She swiped her mouth, balled the tissue, tossed it into the wastebasket, and looked west through the opposite set of windows at the curved horizon where the sky met the ocean, blue against blue. The cool colors had a way of tempering the heat inside Violet's lungs. I'll stop there. But you can see that I'm using the landscape to mirror the discomfort or the pain that Violet is feeling, the yearning, the emotional state really that she's yearning with, and even the choice of colors and what you notice that she observes in her world. It sets a tone for who she is. So it's not just like a stage set where you just have a bunch of things in the background so that you know where she is. There's a bigger use of it than that. It's to reveal who she is and how she feels about the world and how she sees the world. So that's really my jumping off point. I know that we're going to engage in a conversation and you have some questions for me.
Well, I've got, yeah, I should tell you that I love the book. I think Violet is a wonderful character, and I'm kind of interested in what was the source of the book. I mean, what was the source of the plot? Was Violet based on anyone in particular that you knew, or how did it come to be?
Well, strangely, it came about through something that from my own family, an incident in my own family where I found out a few years ago that my grandmother was a child in a house where her father, my great grandfather, was a whiskey runner during Prohibition. And he had a still in the basement. And he and his oldest son were running it. And the still exploded. And that explosion resulted in the death of his oldest son's infant daughter. So my great grandfather and my great uncle went to prison. And my grandmother, who was just, I think, a 4-year-old at the time, was sent away to be raised by her older sister, who had already gone off and gotten married. So I knew that she was raised by her sister. My father knew that she was raised by her sister, but it wasn't until just a few years ago, long after the death of my grandmother, and my father was already in his 80s, that we found out that this was why. A cousin had told me the story, and I ended up uncovering the news articles about it and reading how it all unfolded and how they went to prison. So it just got me thinking about several things. One, that so many people, especially of an older generation, have a whole lifetime that they've lived, and the people who've come after them know nothing about it. It's very common for things not to be talked about, especially if you've lived through things like wars and depression. And there's a certain, I think, cultural stigma for that generation to talk about themselves. So how do we know? I mean, we don't know the secret lives of so many of our own family members. So that was the first thing. And the other thing is, I couldn't help but wonder how my grandmother's life had changed from that moment on. I mean, she ended up being raised by a very loving sister, and it turned out great for her. But what if it hadn't? I mean, she was just sent away. And so that got me thinking about Violet Swan. It was first the still exploding. And then I thought, well, what if that happened to a child and the consequences were dire? What if she was burned? What if, she lost a close family member, and her life from that moment on would never be the same again? So that was the first thing. And the other thing was, I wanted to create a character who created beautiful art and offered that up to the world, even though she lived through a tremendous amount of tragedy and trauma. That she didn't become bitter. She became even more in love with the world, essentially, and made a decision. And she's a prodigy, really, because she knows from a very young age that she wants to be a painter. And what she does is she offers up artwork that has the effect through the simple use of color and shape and lines to evoke emotion like happiness and joy. And there is an artist who has very similar work, and that's Agnes Martin. So that's whose artwork I used as an inspiration for Violet Swan's artwork.
It's interesting the way you talk about Violet Swan. It seems like she's almost a real person to you. I mean, do you kind of feel like your characters are real people to you?
Absolutely, absolutely. I always miss them terribly once a book is finished. I really mourn the loss of their company. You know, it takes several years to write a book, and you spend that entire time in their world very intimately, and then all of a sudden it just stops and they're gone. And yeah, I miss them. I really feel a tremendous amount of affection for Violet Swan. She's one of the characters that I miss the most.
That's interesting. One of the things I've noticed is in your books, there tends to be quite a few like violent episodes. I've noticed, there are people that get shot. There's a still exploding. There's there's an earthquake. So even nature is violent. Violet experienced some episodes of violence from other people. So I'm wondering, why do you include, and I think in another one of your books, there's actually bombs exploding. So I'm sort of interested in why you include violent episodes like that. Why do you incorporate that into your novels?
Well, I think mostly because you have to have some sort of calamity in order for there to be a story. Things have to go wrong, and they have to go wrong badly in order for a story to be interesting, and for you to be able to carry it for 300 pages. You have to have an oversized dilemma. Mm-hmm. And then it takes a while to figure out how to deal with that dilemma. I think violence for me is, I grew up in a pretty rowdy environment. My family on both sides come from Appalachia. So I'm used to people, literally shooting each other, and living to tell about it. But having said that, I think violence is, I feel like it's something that is always, if the circumstances are right, that any of us are capable of it. And it's this source of energy that is always trying to be, we as humans are always trying to temper it down. And so if I had to guess, that's what I would say, because I'm not entirely sure. No one's ever asked me that question before.
Oh, really? Yeah. I was really struck by it. Like in the time when birds, come back. There's, one of the seminal moments is a robbery and a shooting, and so I was just sort of struck by that, and in the Violet Swan book, you start out with a very violent natural occurrence. And so yeah, I think that's interesting. We have a question. So other people are asking me questions, so you don't have to just rely on me. We have a question.
Oh yeah, feel free.
Okay. So what type of research do you do when you're preparing, to write a novel? How do you do your research? What kind of research do you do?
Well, this is the Violet Swan novel is the book that I had to do the most research for, because it's written basically in two timelines. One when she's a child, and that is a bit more historical fiction, and then the current day. And I needed to learn about what life was like during World War II in certain parts of the country. I needed to learn what a woman might be able to do for work during the war. everything from what would be in the news, what she might have read in a magazine. For example, I needed, there's a scene in there where Violet goes to a newsstand and she buys a Vogue magazine, and it's I think it's 1944. And I know from, in the book I've got, it's July, and there's this time clock that's ticking because she's pregnant. And so, I had to figure out exactly what time it was. So it's July and it's 1944. What was there a Vogue magazine that, and sure enough, I went online and I found the exact magazine on eBay. And so what you read in the book that she's reading, which is an article by Dorothy Parker, is actually in the July issue of Vogue I think it's 1944. So that was really fun to uncover that sort of thing. And then in my book before that, these are the days when birds come back. That book is a lot about Sears Kit's homes. There are these two homes that are being that are side by side that this family owns, and one of them is being renovated. And so I had to do research on how they were built and how they were delivered and all of that. But generally speaking, what I will say is that I wait and do the research after, because I don't know if a writer asked that question, but if I'm going to guess, maybe it was a writer who asked me that question, because you can get really bogged down and go down the rabbit hole of research for a book and never actually write the book. And so what I do, because books are about the people who inhabit them, they're not about the details of the time period and such. So what I do is I get to know the characters first. I write out their stories first, and I literally will put in different places in parentheses, add research about, fill in the blank here, and I move on. And then when it comes time to add that in, that's when I sit down at the computer or wherever else I'm going to be doing the research and books. And I fill that in, because I think if you do it the other way around, it feels contrived. It feels like, oh, you can feel the author in there showing us how smart they are about, B-2 bombers or something. And it doesn't quite feel like the art of fiction when that happens.
Okay. Well, we have another question, I think also from another writer.
Okay.
That's asked you, what is your writing process? Do you write every day? And do you have certain hours that you write? That you work?
Yeah, it's pretty routine for me at this point. I write very early in the morning. I usually get up around 5:30 and I have some coffee and a little bit of breakfast along the way, but I just sit down and I just start writing. And when I'm further along in a book and getting closer to a deadline, especially, I will write for a good 7 hours before I'll be able to quit. In the beginning, it's a little spottier than that, but I do when I'm not on a plane and going somewhere and I'm settled, I do write every day. It's the first thing I do in the morning before the world has time to interfere with my sensibilities. And I will say that, everybody has their own process. I know a lot of writers who they get their creative energy going in the evenings, the middle of the day, but that's not me. I'm tired at the end of the day. I have my most active brain, and it's just trained that way. I've been doing it for years, first thing in the morning.
So can you talk a little bit about your creative process in the sense of, are you an outliner, or are you somebody that waits for things to organically develop, or?
I don't do an outline at all. I don't know how the story's going to end. I don't necessarily know where it's going until I'm further along. I always start, like I mentioned, with a sense of place. I know where the characters live. And so if I know where they live, then I know what they see on any given day. I know what kind of people they might be, at least what kind of people they might encounter. I know what kind of trees they'll encounter, what kind of wildlife, what kind of climate. And I think about the kind of person that I would like to create that would be interesting to me. For example, the book I'm working on right now, the main character is a former opera singer. And I don't know much about opera, so I'm studying it now. I'm learning, and it's just wonderful to be able to learn something brand new. And that keeps me interested in this character and in writing the book. But no, I just sit down every day and have faith that my imagination will create something that will take me to the next place and the next place and the next place. But if you put two people in a room, sooner or later, they're going to either fight or fall in love. Something's going to happen, right? Right. And give them a violent storm to boot, things will transpire. They just do.
That's true. That's true. What's interesting, you seem to be really drawn to very creative protagonists, so Olive Swan is a painter. I think you've had in one of your earlier books, there was a singer, and now you're working on an opera singer. So what is there about creative people that draws you to create those kinds of characters?
Yeah, my main character in Olive was an architect.
That's right.
One of my favorite quotes is from Susan Sontag. It goes, "What I wanted was every kind of life, and the writer's life seemed the most inclusive." And I think that each time I step into one of these characters' lives and I help them play out their stories, it's very satisfying to me I think it's a bit like being, I don't know, but I'm guessing an actor, where you get to inhabit other ways of thinking and being. And I think it makes you compassionate and empathetic toward other people as well. And I think I choose the arts because I am a creative person. Most of the people around me that are closest to me are creative people, and I find them to be interesting and dynamic, and sometimes challenging. So yeah, another good question. I've never been asked that one either.
Oh.
You're just knocking them out of the park there, Phyllis.
Okay. Well, let's try for another one. When did you realize that you wanted to be a writer? I mean, how did that come about?
Well, I've always loved reading from a young age. I remember that the first book that I read that I remember reading and I remember being affected by was A Cricket in Times Square. And it just moved me so deeply that I just remember like carrying the story around inside my head. So I've always loved books. And I had an experience in 10th grade where I took a creative writing class and I got an A+ on this short story that I wrote. Which is amazing because I've never been successful in my life at writing short fiction. That was my first and my last, I guess. but what struck me was that my teacher wrote in the margins, "You could be a writer." And that was the craziest thing. I was so taken aback. I thought he must be a little wacky, because it was so far from my realm of imagination at that point. I come from a very working class family, so it's interesting that everyone around me was factory workers, miners, farmers. So, and then, everyone that I create is someone who really doesn't work with their hands. So I don't know, maybe that has something to do with it as well. But well, now I've completely lost my train of thought.
About why you wanted to become a writer, or when you realized that you were going to be a writer.
Yeah, but I didn't finally fully realize it until I had gotten gotten my bachelor's degree in anthropology with a minor in German. And I was offered an Oregon Laurels scholarship, which is, you don't apply for those, they just are offered to you, to get a master's in anthropology. And for whatever reason, at that point in my life, I really felt it was a crossroads, that if I took that scholarship and I went down that road, I would give everything to it and I would never be a writer. And I suddenly couldn't bear the thought. It just hit me that the thing that I really wanted was not the thing that I had been pursuing. And so I just did a 180 and went for it. I turned down the scholarship and I started writing many, many hours a day. And I'll tell you, it took 10 years, the whole 10 years or 10,000 hours of mastering something, I think was true for me. It took me 10 years before my first book was sold.
Oh, goodness. We have another question from our audience. How much of your own life experience is infused in your characters or stories or story plots?
Not much, really. I gave you the example of the still.
Mm-hmm.
I was kind of planted a seed. But I would say the emotional struggles, or I'm trying to think of the right word. The essence of the struggles that my characters have. I think it was mentioned in the flyer for that I tend to deal with grief and love and despair and self-discovery. Those are themes that have certainly played out in my life. And in that sense, I do carry some of that I breathe that into the life of my characters. But as far as like plot lines and that sort of thing, I don't really use anything from my real life. I mean, little bits and pieces might show up, and sometimes I do it just for fun to, give a nod to somebody that I know, or some circumstance that happened. But generally speaking, it's just the creative process, and these characters become their own people. And, all I know about love and grief and despair and self-discovery is all I have to give them. So in that sense, you can probably see some of me mirrored in them.
What are your literary influences? In other words, what authors do you read? What authors do you think have influenced your writing?
Well, some writers that I really love and that I turn to often for inspiration are Marilynne Robinson. I love the 5 novels that she's written that are interwoven. I love Elizabeth Strout's writing, and she does something similar I do something similar to her, where characters, the setting for the books generally take place in the same area, and characters make cameo appearances from one book to the next. And they kind of weave in and out. And I do the same thing. If in my last, certainly my last, well, Things We Set on Fire, Pale Morning Light with Violet Swan, and The Days When Birds Come Back all have characters that overlap. For example, Quincy, who is the bookstore owner in Pale Morning Light with Violet Swan, is one of the main characters as a little girl in Things We Set on Fire. So definitely Elizabeth Strout. I love Per Pedersen. His book Out Stealing Horses was a huge influence on my writing. In fact, I love that book so much that I wrote a 6-page essay that was published in Poets and Writers magazine on why I love that book so much, and just kind of unraveling, picking apart what it was about it that struck me so deeply. And Kent Harif, I love Kent Harif's writing as well.
Well, we have a question that from the audience that actually is the same question I was going to ask you next. So great minds are thinking alike. So you own the Cloud and Leaf Bookstore in Manzanita. So what have you learned from running a bookstore?
I have learned that people are unbelievably kind. I have had the fortune to meet so many people on a regular basis who come into the bookstore and feel the solace of it, and they have a reverence for it, almost like it's a church. People get quiet, and they love the feel of it. I feel like their mood changes when they come in, and it's incredibly satisfying to send people out into the world with books that are just full of possibilities, and whether it's stories that will move them and change their minds and inspire them, or poetry that speaks to the heart of them. And it's just been one of the most satisfying and rewarding experiences of my life.
Well, you've owned the bookstore for about 2 years, and so maybe this question is a little premature, but do you think that you've learned anything from owning a bookstore that will influence your writing, or already has begun to influence how you approach writing?
No. No. I think, I still like to read the kind of books I like to read, and I still like to write the same kind of books I have liked in the past. I have a better understanding of what people are reading or looking or hoping to read, but I haven't changed anything about the way that I write stories. I think my voice continues to be my voice, regardless of what I see selling, which, are plenty of times books that are nothing at all like what I do. But that doesn't sway me in any way. It doesn't influence me. I never look at the market and say, oh, I think I'll write a book about something like whatever, fill in the blank, because it seems that the market is really interested in that. That just doesn't interest me at all. So no, I just keep doing what I'm doing, and feels like the right thing.
Well, I was kind of intrigued that you wrote 2 thrillers under a pseudonym. And I'm just wondering, why did you use a pseudonym? And well, go ahead.
Oh, well, it's because when I was trying to sell that first novel, Carry Yourself Back to Me, that was my first literary novel. That was back in 2008 or 2009, maybe, when I began trying to sell it. And it was, the recession was happening then, and the publishing industry was imploding. And nobody wanted a quiet novel like that. They wanted a big blockbuster. The market wanted something else, big blockbuster. And then I read this article in the New York Times about how genre writing was weathering the recession just fine. So people were still buying romance and thrillers and horror. And so I just threw up my hands and at that point said, well, then wouldn't it be funny if I just wrote a suspense novel that had some romance in it? And I just threw everything at it. I was basically trying to distract myself from the idea that that novel was going to end up being put in a drawer and never published. And I had worked on it for 10 years. So I wrote this novel, and long story short, it ended up selling. But initially, the reason I used a pen name was because it's not what I normally would do, and it wasn't what I wanted to be known for. So I used a different name, and I thought, well, if it flops, then nobody will know it was me. But then it didn't flop. It sold really well, and no one knew it was me. So I don't know. Maybe the joke was on me. I don't know.
well, you wrote two of them. So
yes.
So did you enjoy writing those books? Or
it was so much fun. It was the most fun I've ever had. Honestly, there was no pain to it. I wrote two because the second one is a sequel to that first one, and that was what the publisher had asked for. And I said, sure, I can do that. This was fun. And so I wrote another one. But during the course of all that, my literary novels sold. And so then I took off from there in that direction, which is what I was originally trying to do in the first place.
So are you tempted to write another thriller sometime?
No, but I mean, I did that a little bit with Olive. It's a little bit of a psychological thriller, even though it wasn't so much marketed as that, but it was the one where the bombs are going off and it's a terrorist attack. And so I did that a little bit with that book, but I also, I think it was a great exercise in how to get the reader to turn the page, because I had to focus so much on plot in those books that I continue to do that to some degree, where I try to leave a little bit of an S in at least the nuance of a cliffhanger at the end of each chapter so that the reader wants to keep going. But at this point, I have no plans to write just a straight up thriller again. It's just not what I'm up to anymore.
Okay, so well, you taught novel writing for quite a while. It looks like, and so what kinds of things did you teach your students? What do you think is important when it comes to novel writing?
Well, one of the things was what I mentioned about having a strong sense of place, and having a sharp observation of detail. Specific detail. I think that's always important. It sets apart your character and the scene from anything that could be similar to it. One of the interesting things about doing that program in Germany every summer was that people would come there, they didn't speak the language, they'd never been to Freiburg. It was a 2-week program. And when, as anybody knows who travels, especially to a place you've never been, and if it's a foreign country and you don't speak the language, your senses are really heightened. You're constantly looking at things, you're seeing everything, you're paying close attention because you're having to navigate the world. So, you can remember a meal you ate 5 years ago in Rome and all the details about that dinner better than you can what you had for dinner last Thursday. And there's a reason, because your senses are they're turned up and really working to observe. And I think that's one of the benefits of doing a program like that, is that people are plopped down in a place where they're highly observant. And that's what everyone should be. You should train yourself to be that in your daily life, because we get complacent and we take everything for granted and we stop seeing things. So that's a very important aspect. Sensory details are hugely important. I'm always trying to get students to have sounds and smells and the feel of touch in their work. And I actually bring to class this article that pulled together research that was done on the brain of fiction writers. Maybe some of you have read this, but they did an MRI on people who are reading fiction compared to people who are reading nonfiction. And they found that when reading fiction, when sensory details and metaphor were used to great effect, that the parts of the brain, for example, the part of the brain that would light up if you were actually smelling a lemon would light up when a person was reading about smelling a lemon. So what that does is it pulls the reader becomes even more invested in the story, and they don't even know why. But their brain is lighting up as if they are having this experience in real time. And that is a huge it's just it's like low-hanging fruit, just put some sensory details in there and you can grab a reader without them even knowing why you grabbed them or how you grabbed them. It's a very pleasurable experience too. We want to be able to, when we're reading something, have it unfold and feel like it's happening to us.
So when you're writing a novel, how do you know when you're done?
When your editor says.
Is that right?
Well, that's a good question. And I don't think that there's one answer to that. When you think you're done, the first time you think you're done, you're probably not. I would say 99% sure you're not done. You're closer to being done. But so much of the writing comes in the rewrite of the work. That's where the real beauty of fiction occurs, is when you can go back in and start layering that work with metaphor, with sensory details, with any kinds of pulling threads more tightly. Those are the things that make fiction really work and feel cohesive. And generally, they don't happen until you've done a lot of rewrites. And that's why novels take years to write. It's just very, very time consuming, and you have to let it sit and you have to go back to it again. And it's like marinating. So it's good to have readers that you trust read when you're ready for them to read it. Especially if you're further along as a writer, you don't necessarily want or need someone early in the process to be giving you their opinion. But I have some trusted readers who have read my work for a long time. And mainly my editor, she understands me so well, and she understands my vision, what I'm trying to do, that I never worry that if I show her something, she's gonna steer me in the wrong direction. So it's a long process to feel like you're done. It doesn't happen with a first draft or a second or a third, or it's a multiple work in progress over a long period of time. And you just have to accept that, that you're going to be there for a while.
So, do you have a favorite character that you created, and do you have a least favorite character that you created?
Well, I would say writers often say that their most favorite is their most recent. And I think, that's probably true with me. I mean, Violet Swan is definitely at the very, it's like, having to say which of your children is your favorite. But Violet Swan is definitely, I'm just incredibly fond of her. And as far as, I don't really have a least favorite, and I'll tell you why, because one of my mentors, the writer Jack Driscoll, who's just a fabulous, fabulous writer, and if you haven't read him, you should. He's a poet, short story writer, and a novelist, and he just writes so beautifully and with so much heart. He always said that you should approach your characters with a godlike manner, in the sense that you love them all. If you have any kind of disdain for them, then, or judgment of them, then the reader won't sympathize with them in any way, shape, or form. The reader won't care what happens to them, and you need the reader to care what happens to them. So I've written characters who do terrible things, but I never judge them for it. It's not my place. And I think as a writer, as a creator of an art form, if you are judging it in the process of creating it, it's not going to land well on the page.
We have another question from our audience. What do you recommend to people who want to publish their first book? How hard is it to get published? And do you recommend self-publishing?
Well, it is hard. It's all hard. The writing is hard. The publishing is hard. There's that silly joke. What do you call a writer who doesn't give up? Published. Truly, because all the ones who don't are the ones who just stopped. I think this is it depends on the book, and it depends on the individual. It depends on the plan that the writer has for the work. Some people, they can self-publish and they just want to have a book in their hands, and it doesn't matter if they're not trying to reach a large readership. Maybe they just want something for their friends and their family to have, or something like that. And that's fine. Why not? But if you're going to go the traditional route, you're going to need to play by the rules of the industry. And that is, first and foremost, you have to write a good book. And that has to be your focus. Write the book and make it outstanding. It will find a home. It will. It might be hard. Sometimes, some of the best books out there have had a hard time getting published. But finding an agent and finding a group of people who have your best interest at heart is really the best way to go, if that's what you're hoping for. Because if you get an agent, the agent's going to represent you in the world because they love your work. So you've got a person out there advocating for you, and then that agent finds an editor, and that editor is going to advocate for you. So now you've got two people in the industry who are doing the work that it takes to get your project out there, and so you can keep writing. That's the other thing. If you're going to self-publish, you're going to do all the marketing. You're not going to be a writer anymore, hardly. I mean, because you're going to have to do all the other stuff if you plan on just doing them all like that, or maybe you're just going to do one. But it's a lot of work to do the business end of that, and you just know what you're in for, if that's the way that you decide to go. But just write a good book. That's how you get published, truly.
So can you tell us a little bit more about the book that you're working on now?
I can tell you a little bit. It's really early. It was initially going to be about Quincy, this character again, who's the little girl in one book, the bookstore owner, a very small character in Violet Swan. I was looking at exploring her life between those two books, between the time when she was this young girl and the time when she's an adult. But in the course of that, the opera singer, the older woman who's an opera singer, she took over the story, and now it's her story. And so it's turning out to be quite different. It's really it's shaping up to be between two characters, the woman who's the former opera singer, and she's an older woman, and an older man who is a former ER doctor. And the two of them each have characters from their past who are kind of like ghosts, not in the real sense, but they're people who haunt them in the sense that they're having trouble reconciling what happened with those people. And so it's about this woman and this man coming together in Nestucca Beach, which is really Manzanita. And the two of them reconciling these kind of ghosts that they carry with them. And it's about music, and it's about, science and the natural world, and all kinds of other things as well.
Do you have any idea when it might be coming out yet, or is it way too early to know?
It's way too early. It's way too early. I have to write the good book first.
Okay.
But I hope that by next year I'll have a good draft, and I'll have a good sense of when it might be published. I don't know. My publisher was just sold to another publisher, so my books are with Houghton Mifflin, and HarperCollins just bought Houghton Mifflin, and my editor's still there, but everything is just sort of in flux, and I'm just putting on blinders and just writing the book and hoping for the best.
Okay. Do you ever get writer's block?
I never do. I don't know. I never do, but I'm always, again, like engaged with the world. And knock on wood, it just never happened to me. I'm always reading, I'm always writing. I feel like I have the opposite. Like I have too many stories, and I have to sort of narrow them down instead of searching for something to write about. I just feel like there's endless possibilities for stories, and no, for me, I don't. And I feel terrible for people who do, because I can't imagine what that would feel like.
Well, I just realized that it's midnight in Berlin right now, isn't it?
It is, yeah. But I'm jet lagged, so it's not so bad.
But I really want to thank you so much for joining us today, and for taking us international. Now we can sort of point to that.
Yes.
And I've really enjoyed talking with you today. So
Me
thank
too.
you so much. And I hope next time that you're in Manzanita that you come up to Cannon Beach and and come to the library.
Oh yeah, definitely. Be careful with all the rain.
Okay, thank you. You take care.
Okay, take care. Okay,
Bye-bye.
Wiedersehen.
Auf Wiedersehen. Yeah.